I want to talk about this a little bit. I guess let's begin by just talking about this narrow question on which you and I seemingly have had a difference of opinion in the past, which is you've argued that it doesn't matter what we call the ideology that's animating groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, and that I think you've said that you think it's counterproductive to focus on the link between religious doctrines and terrorism or jihadism. And I think you think I have erred on the side of emphasizing those links. And when I was on your show, you said, well, look, you're not telling the world that Al Qaeda has it right. You're endorsing Al Qaeda's view of Islam. The subtext being that was an incredibly unproductive thing to be doing. Let's talk about that. How would you describe this disagreement?
Sure. And I appreciate your being so forthright and willing to have the conversation. Here's what I worry about. To be clear, I've called this thing radical Islamic terrorism from, I think, the first column I wrote up after 9/11, I called it radical Islamic terrorism. So I have no problem with the phrase. My problem is, as you put it correctly, which is if you draw too close a link to Islam, the religion, and these acts of terror, these acts of violence, these acts of jihad, and say that it is kind of inherent in the religion, that the religion has within it these texts that celebrate violence, that it is in a way a violent religion. My problem with it is this. Firstly, it's sort of ahistorical, because the truth of the matter is Islam has been around for 14 centuries. There have been periods when you've had a lot of suicide bombers, but there have been periods where you haven't. There have been periods where there has been a lot of conflict and clashes with the West. There have been periods where there haven't. There have been periods 300-400 years under the Ottoman Empire where minorities were treated a lot better than under the West. I'm not actually making the case that Islam has a shining track record. What I'm saying is there's variation, and that variation has to do with political, economic, social circumstances. If you lose sight of that and you simply talk about the religion and the text, the danger is that for a lot of people it will sound like you're saying Islam is inherently and irretrievably violent, and there's two problems with that. You'll feed a lot of prejudice and hate. You will convince a lot of Muslims that you're branding them and their religion as kind of irretrievably and irremediably violent. And so, as I say, the historical part makes me feel it's not quite right. It doesn't get at the richness of human experience where Islam has had periods of violence and periods of peace. But more importantly, it's profoundly unhelpful because you're going to feed an enormous amount of hatred. You're going to feed a sense of exclusion and marginalization in the Muslim community. And so if you think it gets at some core, deep intellectual truth, maybe it's worth the price, but you better be damn sure you're getting at something like that, because you're certainly doing something that is going to be profoundly unhelpful on the ground. And I say this, as I say, having lived in Muslim communities. One of the things people make the mistake of doing is to think that Muslims, that to talk about things like this is not racist because Islam is a religion, not a race. I get the point, but for the 1.695 billion Muslims out of the 1.7 or whatever it is, 99.999% of Muslims, they're just Muslim because their parents were Muslim, because they grew up Muslim. It's as much an ascriptive choice, an ascriptive feature of their life as race. They didn't sit down and say, let me do a comparative evaluation of the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran, and I've chosen Islam. They're just Muslims. So when you attack their religion as being inherently violent, to them, it's an assault on them. And if you seek, as I believe you genuinely do, the reform of the religion, which you and I 100% agree on, my point is you're choosing to do so in a way that's not really that intellectually rigorous, that's kind of reductionist and simplified, and you're doing it in a way that's incredibly harmful on the ground. So why do it?
Okay, well, so let me just take a couple of minutes to tell you why I think we should do it. First, let's leave history aside for the moment, because I think you can tell the story of the history two different ways, and one is more plausible and more rigorous than the others. I think, to come back to Huntington for a second, I think his oft-quoted line, which I think was in his book, I don't actually recall reading it in his book, but his line about Islam having bloody borders does account for a fair amount, in that much of the peace you can ascribe to life under Islam is true for two reasons. It's true during periods where you have a truly homogeneous Muslim society that isn't having to play well with others because there are no others to which it's coming into contact, or you have you have people the dhimmi living under them, fully subjugated. So that I think is a bit of an optical illusion. I mean, we're living in a pluralistic world now, and you have to play well with others. And then there's also just the fact that much of the good things said about medieval Islam are said by comparison with the horrors of medieval Christianity.
But that's the only relevant comparison is how other how other societies were organized.
You're not going to get me to defend medieval Christianity. I'm just saying that I think it's useful to we're not going to get a lot of advantage debating the history. I think we should just talk about the facts on the ground in the 21st century. And I think we have to talk about these facts totally honestly. The advantage of doing this is that, one, just reality is on your side. I mean, if you're making your best effort to speak about facts, you're staying in touch with those facts, and you're obliging other people to stay in touch with those facts. And the crucial facts about Islam at this moment is that more than any other religion on earth, it is in dire need of reform. Some of the reasons for this are superficial. They're just accidents of history, and they don't run very deep into doctrine. But some are deep, and they have to do with ways that Islam is actually different from other religions with respect to specific doctrines. And it will be different in 1,000 years if Muslims don't change their approach to these specific theological questions. And so the first thing to admit is that Islam is presenting a range of problems to us that Anglicanism and Mormonism and even Scientology don't. And as you said at the beginning of this conversation, the burden of these problems is felt most acutely by Muslims themselves, right? So the burden of Sunni extremism, for example, is felt most acutely by Shia and Ahmadis and people who are getting their mosques blown up and their wedding parties blown up in places like Pakistan.
And other Sunnis. I mean, all the Sunni,
yes.
all the women in Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely. So I mean, that fact is never far from my mind when I'm criticizing these ideas. We have to admit, again, just talking honestly about what's happening now, much of this insanity has nothing to do with U.S. foreign policy or Israel or anything but religious sectarianism and the doctrine surrounding things like jihad and apostasy and martyrdom and takfirism and blasphemy. And here's another piece here, which I think you have been missing, which is to speak honestly about this. I mean, to put the onus especially on Islam and the need for reform there, right? To not immediately move to, well, Christianity has its people who blow up abortionists, for instance, once every decade and a half. But to keep the focus on Islam empowers the Muslims in the Muslim world who are the most common victims. And so, I mean, to talk about what my friend Majid Nawaz describes as the minorities within the minority, the gays and the free thinkers and the apostates and the liberals like yourself and the people who are uniquely vulnerable within the Muslim community. And so to acknowledge that Islam imposes a credible threat of violence toward apostates, which is just a fact the world over, is to then acknowledge that ex-Muslims, even ex-Muslims living in Manhattan or Beverly Hills, very often have safety concerns that ex-Mormons and even ex-Scientologists don't. I mean, if Leah Remini, the actress, who just famously left Scientology and now has a show, criticizing the treatment of people in the cult, if she was leaving a cult where there was an explicit doctrine that apostates should be killed, if we have L. Ron Hubbard saying this again and again, and Scientologists had a history of reliably killing people who had left their group, she would be in a very different situation, and her security concerns would be excruciating. And that's the situation that many ex-Muslims are in. I hear from ex-Muslims who are afraid that members of their family will kill them, right? And this is something that to just say, well, all religions have their extremists is a way of just not actually responding to that difference.
But I've never said that, to be fair, Sam. I've never been one of these people who said, well, there was Timothy McVeigh and all that. I've always said Islam has a specific problem. As I said to you, Huntington, was right when he talked about how Islam, the problem was largest in the world of Islam. Here's the part that I'm trying to get at, which is when I wrote my essay, Why They Hate Us, it was 2 weeks after 9/11, trying to explain Islamic, the 9/11 attacks. And my whole point was that it didn't have much to do with American foreign policy. It didn't have to do with Israel. It had to do with the breakdown of Arab societies, the stagnation politically, economically, that then led to the rise of this alternative, this violent opposition, which first became Islamic fundamentalism, then became morphed into jihad. And the reason I focus on that is twofold. One is historically, it really is true. I have to tell you, I do contest what you're saying. In the 1950s, if you were to have looked at the world and said what culture or is producing the most violence in the world, nobody would have come up with Islam. If you looked at the Middle East versus East Asia with all the Maoist guerrilla movements, India had 10% of India was being racked by violence from Maoist guerrillas at the time. Most of Latin America was being racked by violence. The world of Islam was relatively peaceful. If you looked at the 1920s, if you looked at the 1880s, when there was this great wave of liberalization and reform in the Middle East. So what I'm trying to get at is the fact that you can find political, social, economic forces that seem to be at work is a hopeful sign, because you can change those. And if you even looked at the variation within the Islamic world today, the vast majority of the violence tends to emanate out of the greater Middle East, which, as you know, accounts for a small percentage of the Muslims of the world, which is not to say there isn't retrograde, bad, nasty stuff going on in Indonesia. But if you look at the violence, almost all of it is coming out of basically the Syria to Nigeria range, and really 5 or 6 countries there. So you have to ask yourself, why those places? Islam is a constant. We have a line in social science. You can't explain a variable with a constant. The violence varies from society to society. Why is it happening? The religious part is the same. The doctrine, the Quran is obviously is the same. So the one point I'm making is that the fact that if you focus on just the book, just the Quran, just the doctrine, you're missing something incredibly important that tells you why there are these varying levels of violence, why there are times of peace and times of war, times of openness. I'm not disagreeing with you that there's always been some problem, and there's always been, then there are inherent features of the religion that make it problematic, just as, frankly, there have been inherent features of Catholicism that made it very prone to being captured by kind of powerful political actors. But I come back to this point, which is, I know that you want to change, you want to reform the world, and I don't think doing things that seem to the vast majority of people, and I say this again as somebody who knows not the kind of atheists who are celebrated in the West by people like you, but the actual reformers who are on the ground trying to make it a little easier to actually enact reform. For them, this stuff is all a kind of anti-Muslim assault, right? It's you're painting their religion as bad. You're telling them that everything they believe, that their religion is inherently bad, is inherently problematic, and it's the inherent part that I'm objecting to.
But I wouldn't use the word inherent to describe the whole religion. And again, everything I'm saying about Islam, a reformer like Maajid Nawaz is also saying. Perhaps we can talk about for a moment how you may disagree with him, but I just want to react to what you just said here, because here you just made a move into history, now recent history, talking about the stagnation in the Arab world largely being a reason for these differences. But again, I would fully grant you that there are political and economic variables here that can make the problem worse. But what the analysis you gave doesn't capture is why, for instance, Palestinian and Egyptian Christians behave differently from their Muslim neighbors. So they haven't produced the same kind of death cult of suicide bombers, and yet they're living in the same stagnant conditions. In fact, their conditions are worse because they're preyed upon by their Muslim neighbors.
Well, precisely. They're minorities, so you don't find Indian Muslims have not adopted the ideology of Hindu nationalism because they are the objects of it. That hardly seems to me so difficult to understand. It's like asking, why did the Jews of Germany not adopt Nazism?
No, but so why aren't Coptic Christians practicing suicide bombings against their Muslim neighbors in reprisal? Why aren't Palestinian Christians who have to go through the same checkpoints in Israel blowing up the Jews in reprisal in the same way, right? I mean, this is just not happening. I mean, maybe you could find one such person who did this, but
no. Of course, you're right. But the point I'm trying to make is, of course, there is an element of this where the religion is feeding into it, and the absolutism of the religion, and parts of the. But it is in combination with these other.
But I can give you the pure case, which is now we have just ad nauseum from all the people in the West who have joined ISIS or groups like ISIS. I mean, so now we have people who could be third-generation British citizens who have degrees in engineering or medicine or computer science, who have no plausible political grievances at all, apart from the imaginary religious ones that suggest that they should go join a group like ISIS.
Of course, and there are ideologies that attract misfit weirdos always. I mean, the Maoist, violent Maoist guerrilla movements attracted a lot of crazy Westerners. I mean, that you're now trying to explain a very large phenomenon by looking at a few hundred isolated.
But it's not a few hundred. I'm just saying that here's my core criticism, which has always been my criticism. I've always recognized that among 1.7 billion Muslims, the percentages that will ascribe to any one strand of the belief is always, you're only talking about those specific percentages when you're talking about specific beliefs. But here we're talking about a real belief, a sincere belief in martyrdom and jihad, right? I mean, this is the mind virus that I think we have to oppose, and that Muslims, above all, have to find some way to oppose.
So let me tell you why I object to the way in which you characterize the problem. If we do have to oppose it, telling people that it comes straight out of the text of their religion, out of a book that 1.7 billion people believe is the word of God, is not helpful.
But the doctrines around jihad and martyrdom do come straight out of the texts, I mean, especially if you take the texts in their totality, not just the Quran, but the Hadith.
Right. So all I'm saying to you is, so either you take the view that these things are rich, complex historical documents that have changed and have been interpreted variously over time, and that there are periods where people did not interpret it this way. For the 400 years of the Ottoman Empire, for 300 years of the Persian Empire, for the entire period of the Egyptian monarchy, it was not interpreted that way. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in the early 20th century, not the early 15th century. So,
Fareed, we're going to, one of us is right about the history, but it doesn't matter.
But actually it does matter, because if you're right, then frankly, there's no hope, right? There's no point.
That would be a very dispiriting conclusion to arrive at.
It's the only one could arrive at on the basis of your analysis. If you say...
You're saying that if the Quran and the Hadith and the biography of Muhammad, if jihad has basically always been holy war in that context, and there's there's a kind of esoteric interpretation of jihad as an inner spiritual struggle, that's a component of it, say, but if holy war has always been what jihad has meant in the first definition, you're saying we are doomed. There's no way. Either we have to rely on a history where there were some centuries where that wasn't the case, or we're just doomed?
Well, I ask you, if what you are saying to people is the only way you could be a believing Muslim and renounce jihad is to essentially reject all the texts and the history and tradition of your religion. All I'm saying is you're asking people, which you have done in the past, essentially to convert, to become non-believing Muslims. And all I'm saying is that ain't going to happen, Sam. So if your goal is actually to reform, then 1.7 billion people aren't going to say, damn, why didn't I think of this? Sam Harris is right. This is a terrible religion. It's full of violence and religion. I should renounce it.
Fareed, let's take the simpler case. This is the simplest possible case. This is really without any possibility of our having a difference of opinion here. The punishments for theft are mandated in the Quran. You cut the hand of the thief, right? Now, this has always been in the Quran, and it has always been the punishment for theft. And now, I'm sure you'll agree that many, many millions of Muslims have realized from some process of having a dialogue with themselves and with with modernity and its new norms, they have realized that they don't want to live this way. They're happy to live in societies where thieves don't get their hands cut off.
But that's precisely my point, Sam, which is that they don't think of themselves as having rejected Islam. They don't think of themselves as having rejected the religion. They simply believe that, societies, the culture, the politics, evolve. And all I'm saying is, if you confront them with a stock, with this, if you say to them, the only way you can reject jihad is to essentially reject the Quran and Muhammad, they're going to say no. If instead you say these standards are evolving, they can be interpreted in various ways. I guess what I'm saying is that the way even Christianity evolved is not. Somebody didn't say, look, everything that God said, that you've been told about Deuteronomy is simply wrong. That all those prescriptions don't exist. People, society evolved. You soften the interpretation of some paragraphs. You highlight the interpretation of others. That's the task I think you should be working on, rather than trying to play this game of saying this stuff is all deeply in the religion and let's not pretend otherwise. All I'm saying is, what good does that do you? Is that going to get you? Is that going to make people say, "Oh yes, we're going to reform the religion," or is it going to get their backs up and make them think Sam Harris is castigating and insulting our religion? My experience from having actually spent a lot of time in Muslim communities is they feel the latter. They feel attacked and besieged.
I guess there's one point of confusion here, is that I really do wear two hats for the purposes of a conversation like this. I'm an atheist who has a general criticism of all faith-based religion. I think modernity and rationality and science need, for the long game, to win all of those arguments. But with respect to Islam in particular and the need to reform it, I'm not trying to win the argument for atheism. Here I'm very aligned with someone like Maajid Nawaz, who, as a Muslim reformer, is making the same kinds of points I'm making now. You have to talk about the fact that the problem actually is this bad, that ISIS does have a very plausible interpretation of the texts, that they're living in a way that would be absolutely recognizable to Muhammad and his closest supporters in the 7th century. And, taking sex slaves, for instance. You can't pretend that sexual slavery is forbidden under Islam, because it's not forbidden under Islam. So Muslims have to find some way to forbid it in concert with a larger conversation about how we want to live in this world. And so you're saying that,
but it is forbidden in virtually every Muslim society. It's this is hardly a difficult or controversial issue. In Indonesia, the largest Muslim society in the world, it does not allow sexual slavery any more than obviously some of it exists in many of these countries, unfortunately. But I guess.
But why not be honest about how they got there? What we need is a confrontation with the fact that these texts as written, the moment you admit that you don't want thieves' hands cut off, you are now giving God less scope over your life, because God told you what to do with thieves.
I guess maybe the broader difference between us is and perhaps this is, I don't know. I actually don't think the way religions get reformed is by having somebody point out all the backward, reactionary, oppressive aspects of the religious texts and demeaning them and sort of insulting them. I think the way that religions reform is that the society evolves and reforms around it, politically, ideologically, in every way. Women become more full participants in society, and then the religion plays catch up. That's what I think happened with Christianity. That's what I think is happening with Islam in those societies in which it really is, moving forward. I've seen it happen in a country like India, in a country like Indonesia. Still a long way to go, still many retrograde elements. But what happens is that the society in general modernizes, and then the religion kind of has to play catch up. I think that reform process is much more durable than somebody just, focusing in on the religion and expecting some kind of theological breakthrough where somebody is going to say, oh my God, the Quran is all wrong. Because I think that while that gets you a lot of applause lines in the West, I don't think that most Muslims particularly in these developing societies, where their religion is a very core part of their identity, are going to go for that. They're going to go for a much more indirect and subtle and kind of complicated view, as you point out. In every Muslim society, other than frankly Saudi Arabia, the amputation of hands is not allowed, and Muslims happily live with it, even though it does exist. That punishment is prescribed in the Quran. So, what doesn't that tell you that the way forward is more the way I'm describing, a broader reform agenda that doesn't try to single out the religion as the problem, which has to therefore be somehow cast aside or discarded or rewritten? Because to do that is all I'm saying is you're not actually going to get the results on the ground that you want. And I think that we do share that.
I think you're way too quick to say that. I fully take your point that there's this other process of just having the religion collide with everything else that's going on in culture, and that provides a moderating influence. And whether you have to spell out why that's all happening in each instance or not, that's to your taste or not. But there's this other feature, which is, given how much people care about the theology and they care that what they're doing is scripturally correct, it becomes immensely powerful to find well-grounded theological ways to get around these intolerant and divisive and violence-producing bits. So if you can have theologians, if you know that the greatest theologians in Cairo can come forward with a fatwa on whatever point with respect to apostasy or blasphemy or jihad or the rights of women, to actually plant a flag on new ground where everyone can see it. Here is why when a woman claims to be raped, you don't need 4 witnesses, right? You can actually submit to a normal secular court process, right? If such a ruling could ever come down.
Yeah, but those people would find that they were arguing against you, who would say, no, it's pretty clear. This stuff is all in the Quran. That's all I'm saying is that you're actually making those people's lives much harder by your continual insistence on a highly literal. That's what I meant when I said you and ISIS were in agreement, or Al Qaeda, which is, it's the reformists, it's the liberals who are trying to massage the text. Let's be honest. And you're the one who keeps pointing relentlessly back. Who's being helpful?
There you've carved out a role for me that really I will never fulfill. There's no cleric who is worried what I think about the basis of their ruling.
You won't be cited as an expert. I'll give you that. But I guess think about it this way, Sam. It was Vatican II. It took Vatican II, which is 1962, before the Catholic Church formally renounced the idea that the Jews killed Christ. That's a generation after the Holocaust.
But Fareed, you're proving my point. It's very important that the Catholic Church did that, rather than all of us just wait for the Catholics to come to their senses without putting any pressure on them.
No, but there you get into a really genuinely difficult problem, which I wish, I don't know how I feel about, but the Islam is more like radical Protestantism. There is no central authority. So when you talk about the imams in Cairo, one of the challenges has been, I've been in Indonesia talking to reformist movements there, and I say to them, hasn't it helped you that Al-Azhar now, because as you know, they have had a lot of these guys issue fatwas like that. And the guy in Indonesia tells me, nobody cares. Our local imam says his interpretation is superior to these guys. And a lot of those imams around the world, unfortunately, have been trained and infected by Saudi Arabia with the kind of Wahhabi ideology. And so Islam doesn't have a single source of centralized authority so that makes it much harder. And so all I'm saying is all the more reason to emphasize a kind of bottom-up reform that encompasses the whole society.
My only point here really, and again, this is something that I'm now mindful of your time, so I want to bring this into the end zone here, is that I feel like you're not seeing how talking about the problem, even the way I do, but especially the way someone like Majid Nawaz does. And again, we make very much the same noises on this particular strand of the conversation, where I talk about Islamism and not Islam per se. This is really under his influence. I talk about the desire to force Islam, the religion, onto society as being Islamism and jihadism being the violent strand of that. But talking about this as a unique problem for one religion at this moment, what this does is that it does acknowledge the unique burden that is placed on the shoulders of those people who are trying to reform it now. I mean, the Mormon reformers do not have as quite the same job that Muslim reformers do.
Yeah, and I've never never argued otherwise. But I would say, and what I try to do by emphasizing the reality that Islam can be different, has been different, that Muslim societies have the capacity to be more tolerant and have done it historically. What I'm doing is trying to make Muslims and Muslim societies understand that they don't have to renounce their religion to be more reform minded. They don't have to they don't have to abnegate. They don't have to become atheists. That there is a path here where they can find some way to make their religion compatible with modernity. And I would argue that that is more likely to be a strategy that moves Islam into the modern world, more securely and more surely than any other. I may be wrong, but as I say, I feel like this is a world I know pretty well, and I do think that sometimes there is a difference between trying to make a point that will attract a lot of attention in the West and make a difference that is going to be felt on the ground in these societies.
Then do you actually think of your approach as being different from Majid's? I mean, would you just consciously disagree with the calls for reform that he makes?
No, I don't. I don't. I'm not as familiar with all of his work as I should be. But I think what I would really emphasize and what is the work of political and economic reform that is taking place in Muslim societies. That where you try to modernize the societies, you try to make them live in a modern context. Let me give you a simple example: Dubai. Okay, if you ask any Muslim anywhere in the world, I'm obviously exaggerating, but like, where would you like to live? Dubai. Dubai is the place that they feel that they are not compromising their Muslim identity, but it feels open and free and modern. Now, the United Arab Emirates is a Wahhabi country. Okay, so if you were to look on the books, what they allow, what they don't allow, but as a practical matter, they have made peace with modernity, and they have made peace with modernity in a way that allows minorities, religions and people from all over the world to work there. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a certain practical reform that I think is much harder to do, which needs to be done. I respect the work that people like Majid do. I respect the work that a lot of other reformers do, as long as it doesn't morph into something that can be seen as a kind of frontal assaults on the religion itself. Not because I have any particular sensitivities about it, but because I think it actually is totally counterproductive. And I think that it's something that might get you funding from some sources in the West, but it's not actually going to do much for you in these countries, because there is this feeling of being besieged in large parts of the Muslim world. And if you're trying to change them, you don't want to set that off. It's sort of like, Americans never understand nationalism. They never go into other countries and understand that you may have a very good idea, but people don't want it imposed from without. They don't want to feel that they are the little mouse being trampled on by the 800-pound gorilla. And there is that feeling after 400 years of Western dominance in large parts of the Muslim world. So if you want to change it, just be aware of that sensibility.
Before I let you go, Fareed, and again, you've been very generous with your time, and so I just will acknowledge to our listeners that you and I haven't said anything like our last word on this topic, or really any of the others. We haven't even said a first word on some of the topics I wanted to cover, like China and North Korea and other things in the news that no doubt you have a lot to say on. There's a phrase that my friend, who again I've mentioned, Ali Rizvi, who wrote The Atheist Muslim, recently tweeted, which I thought was very useful, which kind of cuts through this issue of how do we talk about this particular problem of Islamism, say, without aligning ourselves or seeming to align ourselves with, the alt-right or bigotry against Muslims. And the point he made was the left is wrong about Islam and the right is wrong about Muslims. And that strikes me as very useful. I just wanted to put that into your head because you're often in the position of worrying that a criticism of Islam, the set of doctrines, is grading into or giving energy to the wrong sort of sentiment about Muslims as people, and it becomes an expression of xenophobia, say, and this for me dissects it really nicely. I mean, the left is wrong rather often about Islam. I mean, whether you want to say the left or the far left, but I mean, when we have the hijab being used as a sign of female empowerment, and we have someone like Linda Sarsour, being lionized as a feminist, that suggests a fair amount of confusion on the left about just what it means to empower women and just how many women over the world over wear the hijab voluntarily. But the right is clearly wrong about Muslims. I mean, the bigotry against immigrants just because they're immigrants and all the noises we're getting from Trumpistan on this point are clearly energizing a kind of hatred of people and a fear of people that we don't want to give any energy to. So I just wanted to throw that at you, Fareed, before I let you go.
That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. And I guess what I would say is one of the challenges then for you, it seems to me, is that when you do make the criticisms of Islam, to try to keep in mind that point I was making, that for the vast majority of Muslims, they haven't chosen this religion. They're born into it. And so, and they're born into it, and it makes sense if it helps them make sense of the world and the way in which billions of other people are born into some religion or faith system, and it makes sense. And so when you do criticize it, it does often seem to them as if you are not just being anti-Islam, but anti-Muslim. And, if you're given what your goal is, it does seem to me that's one to think about, right? Which is how best to do that. But in any event, the main point I would make is I think you do an extraordinary job of allowing somebody to disagree with you not just in a civil way, but in a friendly way, but in a productive way. And I learned an awful lot from our exchange. I really respect the fact that you gave me the time, the platform, the opportunity to talk about it, and the fact that we can still be admirers and perhaps even friends at the end of this.
Yeah. Well, to be continued, Fareed. I really appreciate the time you gave me, and people should know I grabbed at least a full extra half hour of your schedule greedily, and still don't feel like I got enough. So we will talk again in some of the context, and I wish you the best with everything you're doing, because I watch your show every Sunday morning, and you are keeping me sane, at least for that hour.
Thank you so much, Sam. Pleasure.
Take care, Fareed.